let's continue from where we were last week. All right. When the hand landed on Mando's arm, he sprang up to meet his challenger, blade at the ready. Vizsla swung at him, his own knife coming to rest under Mando's helmet. The two of them gazed at each other, neither one moving, each waiting to see what the other would do. The armorer stood up. "The Empire is no longer," she said, "and the Beskar has returned. When one chooses to walk the way of the Mandalore, you are both hunter and prey. How can one be a coward if one chooses this way of life?" She turned to Mando. "Have you ever removed your helmet?" "No," he said. "Has it ever been removed by others?" "Never." She nodded. "This is the way." And the others repeated it together, bringing a kind of unity between them, exactly as she'd intended. Mando took a step back from the infantryman and felt some of the tension easing from the room. "This is the way," he said. The armorer turned her attention to the fractured breastplate and shoulder piece of his armor. "What caused this damage?" "A mudhorn." "Then you have earned the mudhorn as your signet," she said. "I shall craft it." "I can't accept," Mando said. "It wasn't a noble kill," he hesitated. "I was helped by an enemy." "Why would an enemy help you in battle?" He thought of the child holding up his hand, the strain of the effort making him tremble. "It did not know it was my enemy." "Since you forego a signet, I shall use the excess to forge whistling birds," the armorer said, referring to a Mandalorian weapon. "They are a powerful defense against enemies. Use them sparingly, for they are rare." The Mandalorian stepped back to wait. As the armorer worked the metal in the forge, something about the crash of the hammer and the hiss of molten steel summoned memories. With merciless clarity, sounds and sensations so vivid that they didn't seem like memories at all, but the events themselves happening all over again. There he was with his parents, the three of them terribly exposed and hunted across open ground as the street exploded around them. The battle droids closing in. Mando could smell the smoke and hear the screams. He saw his parents' faces as the world closed in around them. He felt his mother's hands press against his shoulders, holding him tightly one last time before they placed him in a bunker, closing the doors. The final glimpse of them was reduced to a thin sliver of light before an explosion wiped away all trace that they'd ever existed. Mando caught his breath. His heart was pounding, his throat dry as the sand of Arvala 7. He'd seen it all again, lived it again. It wasn't the first time, nor would it be the last. Chapter 11. I want my next job. Mando and Greef Karga were at the public house, seated at Karga's regular table. The Mandalorian had walked in wearing his newly forged armor, made from freshly shaped Beskar that still gleamed from the armorer's forge. The helmet and visor had kicked back glints of light as he made his way across the room. As he sat down, there was no mistaking the jealousy and resentment in the eyes of the other hunters around them, all of whom had no doubt seen the client's reward as rightfully their own. Karga, who was delighted to raise his glass to his most famous hunter's success, and the fortune it had brought them both, had tapped the plate of Beskar he'd tucked away in his front pocket over his heart. "Even I'm rich," Karga had chuckled, and then appeared disappointed that his companion didn't join him in his glee. He might not have expected the bounty hunter to gloat over his victory, but the Mandalorian's immediate request for more work had clearly caught him off guard. Next job? Karga's face seemed to grow longer with disbelief. Why don't you take some time off? Enjoy yourself. I want my next job. Karga sighed. Fine, he said. I know you hunters like to stay busy. The Mandalorian waited. Before their conversation was over, he had accepted the highest-paying bounty that Karga had to offer, a nobleman's son who had skipped bail. With the bounty puck in his hand, he got up and walked out, determined to get to his ship and leave Navarro as soon as possible, as if that would somehow erase the memory of the child. And at first it actually did seem to help. A new mission, the new armor, the familiar rituals of boarding the Razor Crest, powering up the engines, and entering in the destination coordinates for the navigation system. All of these things were enough to take his mind off of what he was leaving behind. He almost made it, but then he reached for the lever. That was where the ball had been, the one that the child had unscrewed because it was small and bright and round, and caught his eye. The Mandalorian looked down. The ball itself was lying next to the lever. He picked it up and rolled it between his fingers, thinking again of the child's frightened face as Dr. Pershing had pushed the pram away, remembering that fearful, plaintive cry. As he reattached the ball, screwing it back into place, he paused, lost in thought. He powered the engines down, climbed out of the ship, and started back into town. I don't care, the client was saying, his voice crackling from the long-distance microphone. Mando held to the earpiece inside his helmet. I order you to extract the necessary material and be done with it. Mando was perched on a rooftop, using the scanner in his helmet to listen in on the conversation. He'd crept up there after emerging from the alleyway alongside the safe house, where he had found the child's hover pram shoved into a refuse bin. Seeing it there, tossed out like common trash, eliminated any remaining doubt he might have had about what he'd come back to. He walked up to the entrance to the safe house, placed the thermal detonator against the door, and set the timing device. What happened next would either succeed or fail, but he already knew there was no other choice. From that point on, there would be no turning back. In the years to come, when the balladeers of Navarro spoke of the day the Mandalorian broke the code and signed his own death warrant, there was as many different versions of the events as there were ears to hear it. But it always started with the explosion. The great charge was powerful enough to rip the door from its gaskets, and a moment later Mando was inside the safe house, making his way through the smoke and flying sparks, already taking fire from the stormtroopers. Some said a dozen, some said more, who'd come running at the sound. The troopers did what they were famous for, fighting, then dying, while Mando fought his way back through the tunnel leading to Dr. Pershing's lab. When he walked in, Pershing was already in the process of extracting something from the child. Mando grabbed the doctor and thrust him aside, and Pershing landed on the floor, on his knees, hands held up in front of his face. Please, he said, I'm trying to save it. I'm the only reason it's still alive. Mando picked up the child and tucked it under his arm. Turning, he stepped back out into the corridor, blaster at the ready. The stormtroopers were already swarming toward him, firing from all sides. Dodging the bounty hunter drew back, fired, and disappeared into the shadows. He could hear more troopers running down through the adjoining corridor, conferring with one another, determined to flush him out. A volley of blaster fire tore through the hallway. A shock struck the wall beside his head, and he felt the child flinch in his arms. The Mandalorian fired back, then turned and saw a trooper in front of him preparing to shoot. He pointed the prongs at the end of his disruptor rifle at the attacker's breastplate and sent a crackling burst of electricity through his armor. Aiming at the second trooper behind him, the bounty hunter blasted him with his flamethrower and sent him backward, howling. Still, they kept coming. At the end of the hallway, he cut back the way he'd entered, pausing to listen to the footsteps of more troopers, then taking them out. By the time he'd reached the client's office, where he'd first accepted the Beskar, he found himself surrounded. "Freeze! Don't move! Hands up! Drop the blaster!" The Mandalorian felt the weight of the child in his arms, heard him whimper, saw the gleaming eyes moving to look up at him. Slowly, he lowered his weapon. "Wait," he said. "What I'm holding is very valuable. Here." He knelt down and placed his blaster pistol on the floor in front of him, and as the stormtroopers came in closer, whistling birds, the tiny projectiles burst out of his gauntlet, spiraling and corkscrewing in a dozen different directions at once, cutting through the troopers with lethal precision. Within seconds, they had all dropped to the floor. Mando stepped over their bodies and kept moving. All across Navarro, in every cantina and on every street corner, every bounty hunter's fob began blinking red. Emerging from the safe house and into the open, the Mandalorian didn't need to look around to sense the net closing around him. He recognized the footsteps of his competitors, heard the high-pitched electronic alerts going off, pinging off the walls of the city. The atmosphere seemed to constrict around him, as if the air itself was a web. At the far end of the street, he saw Grief Karga waiting for him, his old friend's hands spread in a gesture of false pleasantry. "Welcome back, Mando," Karga exclaimed, and then, with all his pretense draining away, "Now put the package down." The Mandalorian didn't move. "Step aside," he said, aware of the sheer scope of firepower pointed in his direction from all sides. No one moved. To his right, perhaps a meter away, there was a slight humming sound coming from a commercial speeder piloted by a frightened-looking R6 unit. "I'm going to my ship." "You put the bounty down," Karga said. "Then perhaps I'll let you pass." "The kid's coming with me." "If you truly care about the kid," Karga replied, "then you'll put it on the speeder, and we'll discuss terms." This was the standard back and forth, and Mando knew what his next question was expected to be. "How do I know I can trust you?" "Because I'm your only hope," Karga replied, with the utter confidence of someone who'd completely believed every word he was saying. It seemed that Grief Karga had flattered himself into believing that he knew Mando, and could predict what the Mandalorian would do, what he would choose, and how he would react. The Mandalorian looked at Karga and waited, letting the moment draw out. Then, in a single, fluid motion, he leapt into the speeder, flipping his body to protect the child, and started firing, taking out 2 of the nearest bounty hunters in the time it took to land on the speeder's inside deck. The element of surprise was just enough for him to get the attention of the speeder droid. "Drive," Mando told it, and when the droid beeped in a panicked refusal, he pointed his blaster at it. "Drive!" The droid whooped, and the speeder burst into motion, careening down the street while Mando kept shooting, keeping the child close to him, taking out hunters on either side, then switching over to the disruptor rifle to obliterate those last few before they could get in a shot. Somewhere, Karga was roaring at them, somewhat absurdly, not to shoot the target. Everyone seemed to be shooting everywhere. At the far end of the street, the speeder finally collided with a pile of rubble, jerking to a halt, and from inside, Mando heard its thrusters die with a final hiss. We're going to stop here. I'm going to pause this, and then I will record another one, and we will have part 2. So this is the end of part 1, and you can look for part 2.